So once you've installed your center back zipper, be that centered, lapped, or invisible zipper, and you've finished off the rest of your center back seam, you probably have something that looks a little bit like this: 2 layers of fabric with a center back seam that stops at the tailor's tack. Now from the right side of the garment, we have a couple of options. We can stick with a vent where all of the seam allowance, these extra little outlets that are included in the center back, both go to the same side. And that creates a vent like this, where one side is folded back to create a nice clean finish down center back, and the remaining side lays flat so that if this lifts up a little bit, there's a little bit of modesty underneath, so you can't see right through the slit of the skirt. Or you can press the seam open completely from the tailor's tack all the way down to create a slit instead, where each individual outlet of fabric turns back on itself to create a slit down the center back. So while someone's walking, this will fly away. It's completely up to you whether you prefer the look of a slit, where these can flap independently, or the look of a vent, where there's a little bit more modesty underneath. But I'll show you how to do both. Let's consider the vent first of all. Let me zoom in here. You can see where my stitching is. Again, 3/4 inch seam allowance, stopping and back tacking at my tailor's tack. Now, if I want to do a vent, I'm going to go back to the sewing machine, place my needle a few stitches back from where I left off, overlap my stitches to my tailor's tack, pivot at my tailor's tack, and then sew at a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Pivot at my tailor's tack and then sew at a 1/2 inch seam allowance, reinforcing a back tack stitch here near the 2 ends. Now remember, both layers are laid together. I'm just going to mark my 1/2 inch seam allowance. And you should see, if you line up the 1/2 inch mark on your ruler with the raw edge here on this little angled piece, it should match up to your tailor's tack. So I'm just going to identify this, and I'll go back to the sewing machine and sew that together. So back at my sewing machine, here is where I left off with my stitching at my tailor's tack. I'm just going to place my needle a few stitches back, lower that into my work, take my few stitches forwards, overlapping my stitches at my tailor's tack, keep my needle down in my work, lift my presser foot, turn and pivot, and then I'll continue off the rest of this edge. And back tacking as I reach the end here. Clean up my thread tails. So now we've got our center back seam that continues all the way to the tailor's tack, pivots, and then goes off the edge, back tacking here to hold it in place. Now at the iron, there's my stitching going off into my corner. I now want to decide which side I want my vent to open up from. If I keep it in this direction, I'm going to open it this way. If, however, I want to open my seam allowance in this direction, you can see underneath my fabric, then at this side, flaps open. I am going to keep this nice and flat like this and turn this open here. There should be a set of notches down at the bottom of your, at the hem of your skirt. There's my notch right there. those indicate where your tailor's tack, your center back seam, continues down into the hemline. So look for those notches. There's a notch down there to identify where that goes. So from my center back to my notch down here, I'm going to fold back, making sure that I'm folding along that notch, and I'm going to press my seam. Just get a fold into this area right down here. You'll notice from the inside, however, all of my center back seam allowances are going to go all in one direction. I've got to prevent that from happening. I want to be able to open this seam. So I'm going to, there's a couple of options. You can either press this open, allowing the seam allowance to kind of twist on itself, or you can clip into the seam allowance. Clipping produces a cleaner finish, but it does go through your serge stitching or any kind of finish you might have. So consider that. If you want to keep your seam finish intact, you can press this open up here and then allow the seam allowance to twist itself in one direction. Otherwise, I'm going to lift up this upper piece of my seam allowance and clip right into that corner. I don't want to clip through my stitching, but I'm going to get real close to it. Within about 1/8 of an inch, only through this top layer. I don't want to clip through both layers. This is similar to the clipping we did on the inseam pocket, where we only want to clip one side, allowing us to open this seam up while allowing the rest of the seam allowance to lay in one direction. Okay, so again, you have an option to keep that and letting it twist, but this gives you a much flatter, cleaner finish. So we've got our vent, but then what do we do about the bottom of our work here where our hem needs to go? We've got to clean finish this. So pay close attention to what's about to happen. This is the right side of my sample. I can't see my seam allowance here. I'm going to take this side right here, the one that is folded underneath itself. Of course, your garment would have interfacing back here and interfacing in here. But this one side where I've got this nice and clean finish, everything's folded back onto itself. Excuse my iron. I'm going to open this back up, unfold it, and there should be another set of notches to indicate where your hem allowance is. So take a look, try and find that notch. It's going to be 1.25 inches from the cut edge. So it's the same hem allowance as what we did for our sample books. 1 inch and 1/4. So 1.25 inches. Now I have it folded like this. Makes a nice clean finish, but I'm going to do something a little counterintuitive. I'm going to open this back up and I'm going to fold it back. Fold it against itself. Again, looking for that notch. That notch should be right on that fold. I'm going to fold it in the opposite direction. It's going to make a weird kind of twisty thing going on, but what I'm doing is I'm taking the right sides of my vent fabric and putting them right sides together. I'm going to pin this in place just so it doesn't move around on me. And using my ruler and a friction pen, I want to make sure I make a line right where this notch is all the way across this folded edge. Again, that's 1.25 inches from the raw edge. So I'm going to measure 1.25 inches from that raw edge. There we go. 1.25 inches, 2 extra little squares, and I'm just going to give myself a mark just across where it's folded to where my serge stitching ends. Now, you may have a different kind of finish on this end. You might have turned and stitched. You might have it bias bound or something like that. I recommend the serging for the center back, but we can see 1.25 inches from that raw edge. Now it's pinned in place. It's ready to go. I'm going to go to the sewing machine again. I'm going to stitch along this line, just within this segment here. I'm not going to go all the way off of the edge. I don't need to worry about what's going on there. But I'm going to stitch this together Back tack at the beginning and back tack at the end. Starting at my folded edge, 2 stitches forward, 2 stitches back to back tack. And stitch all the way across this folded segment till I get back to my serge stitching, and then back tack again. Uptake lever up, remove your work, snip your threads. So here it's folded back on itself. Remember, everything's going to be kind of twisting around on itself because we want to put the right sides together and stitch at 1 1/4 inch from the raw edge, back tacking here all the way across till you get to that serge stitching, and then back tack again at this end just to hold this in place. Let's head back to the work table because we're going to have to clean up some of this seam allowance and hem allowance. Okay. So it's looking real wonky. Here's the right side of my sample. Everything's kind of tucked up inside of itself and doing some strange stuff. Here's the wrong side. Everything's looking kind of weird right now. Just trust me. Here's that segment that we just sewed. Right along here. I'm going to grab my ruler, my friction pen, and have a pair of scissors handy because we're going to be cutting into some stuff. Pay close attention to what I'm about to do. I'll show you again how we do this in just a moment, but just pay close attention to what we're about to do. From this seam line, this stitching line right here, 1 1/4 up from our raw edge, I'm going to measure a 1/4 inch down, 1/4 inch down towards this raw edge. So I'm going to place my ruler here and 2 little squares, 1, 2, I'm going to place that right on that seam line I just sewed. And then I'm going to measure 1/4 inch down. So that's a 1/4 inch down towards the bottom edge of the raw edge of my hem here. From this edge here, where I've got my serge stitching, I'm going to measure a 1/2 inch towards my folded edge. So again, that's 4 little squares, lining that up along the serge edge here. And I'm going to place a line down here. So again, that's 1/4 inch down towards the raw edge and 1/2 inch towards the folded edge. Makes no sense to sketch it out over here. We're not doing anything over here. We're taking care of this little section in here. So there's my original line of stitching right here. That's where I just sewed on the sewing machine. There we go. So this is where I just serged on the sewing machine. 1 1/2 inch up from the raw edge, right along here. I measured down 1/4 inch and made a mark for myself, made a line for myself. And then from my serged edge, I measured in 1/2 inch towards my fold. That's where my folded edge is right here. Remember, that notch should be right on that fold. So a 1/2 inch in, and I've made this little square. It's a little rectangle. It's not even a square. I don't know why I call it a square. It's clearly a rectangle. Got a line here and a corner and another line here. I'm going to cut this out. I'm going to cut through both layers and cut out that rectangle. There we go. There's that little folded rectangle. Don't need that anymore. Taking care of that extra fabric in there. By cutting this out, we're reducing a lot of bulk. We're about to turn this right side out because right now the right sides of our garment are folded in on each other. And we need to turn this corner right side out. And if we leave all this extra seam allowance, hem allowance, it's going to be too bulky. Now I've got this little extra piece hanging out here. This is perfectly fine. What's going on down here with the rest of my garment, not going to touch it. That's exactly what I want. But this little flappy bit, this is just going to get in my way. So I'm going to get rid of it. Just going to continue that 1/4 inch cutting line and just trim that off. Get rid of that. What I do want to keep is this little section here. This should extend beyond this cut edge. We don't want this cut edge to match up over here because then we're going to have trouble finishing off our work. But this is perfectly fine. Cut that little rectangle out and then trim off that little bit of fabric hanging out. Now from this point we can turn everything right side out. I'm just going to do one more thing, and right along this corner I'm going to cut this at an angle. Again, to reduce some of the bulk. You can see where my stitching line is, about 1/8 of an inch down. I'm going to save about 1/8 of an inch of my seam allowance. I'm just going to cut this at a 45-degree angle. Again, this is just to reduce bulk. You don't have to do this, but it helps to reduce bulk. I'll go to the iron, place my tailor's point. Just inside of here, so you can lift this up. Slide the tailor's point inside of there and press this flat. I'm going to go do that on the iron. So there's that little 1/4 inch seam allowance pressed flat. Nice and clean finished. Now, I'm going to take this corner. Again, everything is inside out right now. Going to pinch that corner between my thumb, pointer finger. My pointer finger is sitting in there, thumb and pointer finger, and I'm just going to push with my thumb, push that corner out. So again, just got my thumb and my pointer finger. Pointer finger is right there on that corner. Thumb is right on the corner. Just going to push that corner out. So I want to give myself a nice clean finish to that corner. By pressing our seam allowance open, it helps to ensure that our seam sits right there along that fold. I'm going to grab my awl or any kind of sharp pointy object, slide that inside, and push that seam allowance out. Try to get my seam allowance to form a nice little point. So I'm just kind of pushing up in this direction with my awl inside of there. You can see my awl pointing through there. Be careful when you're doing this. Make sure you don't put a tear in your fabric. And that should give me a nice clean corner. And now when I lay this flat, it's a nice cleaned corner. And you can already see that my hem is starting to fold all on its own. From the inside, there's my serged edge. And there's that extra 1/2 inch that was overlapping. I'll show you that one more time, just so you can see kind of what's going on here. Here's the opposite side. This is what it looked like from this side with that extra 1/4 inch. And there's that extra 1/2 inch. We trimmed that 1/2 inch off of this section, but we left it here. And by turning this right side out, it allows us to have that extra 1/2 inch of fabric that can tuck itself inside, making a nice clean finish. I can then use a flat catch stitch to hold this piece down and stitch it onto here, but I've got that extra seam allowance hiding under there, so I can make a flat catch stitch or a really quick little whip stitch or running stitch to hold this in place. And you can see my hem allowance is already starting to fold itself underneath. So that takes care of 1/2 of my vent. That's just 1/2 of it. I still got all this hanging out over here. I just need to turn this under. Now there is a notch for where my hem allowance is, but to ensure that everything is as even as possible, we want to finish this end first before we turn under the hem allowance on the other side. So I'm just taking this extra fabric. I'm just going to turn this up underneath itself so it's hiding up and away. And I just want to make sure that these are even, that these two, that this and this lay nice and flat. If something is off, it's not quite lining up properly with the notch, just fold this hem allowance until it matches the same level as the hem allowance on this side. Then you can finger press this just to make sure it's in place, and then go hit this with the iron. If you're working on the full skirt, which I'll show you in a moment, you would then continue pressing the hem allowance all the way around the skirt and get that all pressed into place. Now, consider what you may want to do for your hem finish. If you're doing a blind catch or flat catch stitch, then you're probably going to want to, once you press this, isolate this hem allowance and run it through the serger. And if you're working on a full garment, you would run it through the serger all the way around the skirt until you came back to this little end here and just serge off that edge. And then you've got everything serged, everything's pressed into place, and you're ready for your blind catch. I'm sorry, for your flat catch stitch, or turn this under and do a blind catch stitch. If instead you're going to be doing a slip stitch or a dungaree hem, then you can turn under this extra 1/4 inch while your hem allowance is still loose and available. You can turn under that extra 1/4 inch. Again, finger press this, then press it with the iron, baste it in place, hand baste it in place so it doesn't move. You'd work your way all the way around the skirt until you came back to this end, this end, excuse me, and this end would also get tucked under by a 1/4 inch. And now you've got your folded edge ready for a turned and stitched or dungaree hem or for a slip stitch finish. So that takes care of the vent, if you want to make a vent design, and how you can prep the hem allowance for either a flat catch, blind catch, slip stitch, or dungaree hem. Let's take a look at the options for a slit instead. Here's another copy of my center back seam stopping at my tailor's tack. This is a little bit different. I'm going to open this up, wrong side's up. Again, I'm going to look for the notches down here at the bottom and use those to help me line up my hem allowance. Line up my center back seam and fold along those notches. Again, this is wrong side, the wrong side of the sample, so this would be the inside of your garment. I'm going to look for that little notch down there. Line up my center back fold along that notch and finger press that in place. I'll take this to the iron and press the whole thing open like this. If you do not use those notches to align your fold, you run the risk of having your fold have a gap in it or have it slightly overlap. If you're not folding along that notch properly, it can lead to some strange things going on. So make sure you're using those notches to your advantage. That way the slit fold goes right down the center back. Nice clean finish. Now, we can already see we got the start to a slit. What else do we need to do? Well, we need to take care of what's going on up here. With our vent, we had everything sewn into place. It was fine. We didn't really have to worry about it dropping or doing any weird stuff, but we've got loose fabric hanging out here. So we need to stitch through all of this. I'm going to turn this to the right side of my garment because this is a top stitch that we're getting ready to do. And I like to top stitch from the top or the outside of my garment so I can see what I'm doing. I'm going to use my muslin to my advantage. I can see where that angle is going. If you cannot see that, instead your fabric is very thick or opaque and you can't quite see that. Here, I'm working on the wrong side here so you can see what I'm about to do. Just as we did with the vent, we're going to measure a 1/2 inch in from this angled edge. I'm going to place that on my ruler, 1/2 inch, and then I'm going to draw my lines here to my tailor's tack. And I'm going to do the same over here. I got to lock down both sides. So 1/2 inch to my tailor's tack. There we go. Best thing to do at this point is to hand baste this in place so you can find where your mark should be on the front side of your fabric. Just going to use a single length of thread. Just going to make these stitches relatively quick because I just want to copy these marks to the right side of my fabric just so I can see where they are. This is not necessarily basting at this point. We are thread tracing. We're using the thread to trace our lines from one side of the garment to the other. I'll just go over this little corner because I know these are going to meet at this corner. You can use these as basting stitches if you like. If you feel more confident with having this locked down with the hand basting stitches, by all means, keep them in. Just know that you'll need to remove them. So that's the wrong side, flip it to the right side, and voila, I can see exactly where those lines need to be. I just need to straighten them up a little bit. Okay, cool. I can copy those lines with my friction pen. If you're working with a printed fabric and the friction pen doesn't show up so well, just use the thread tracing as your guideline. I'm going to remove my threads just because I don't want them in my way and I don't really want to fight to remove them afterwards. So slide those out. And now I can go to the machine and top stitch this into place. I'm going to start from my tailor's tack from the center, lowering my needle right there, back tack, follow my line till it gets to the edge here, and back tack again. Now I can just trim my threads, but I am going to leave some tails. That way I can pull my threads to the wrong side of my sample and tie them in knots, give them a cleaner finish. Before I do that, let me take care of this other side. Okay, again, I will leave some tails of thread, and then I'll pull all my threads to the wrong side of my sample, just like we do when we're finishing off the top stitching for the centered zipper, I'm sorry, for the lap zipper. So there is my top stitching for my slit. You can also pull the threads through to run one side for these stitches up here as well. But over here on the ends, I'm going to pull mine through to one side and tie them in knots just to secure them. Just as we've done before, I'm going to tug on my bobbin thread until I see a loop of my top thread coming through. Pull those through, and now I've got both tails on one side of my garment, and I can tie those in knots to clean finish them. Leave some tiny tails. Same thing over here. Pull my bobbin thread. I can see my top thread, a loop of my top thread coming through. And tie those into a couple of square knots. Leave a couple of tiny tails. Top stitching is done. I'm just going to hit this with the iron really quick, get rid of my friction pen marks. There we go. There is my top stitching for my slit. Now, just as we did with the vent, the slit's nice and it's looking pretty good, but what do we do about the hem? We've got these raw edges hanging out here. We don't want to just fold this up because then we're going to have weird folded edges hanging out here. So we're going to do the exact same thing we did for the vent. I'm going to take one side, so you'll see this whole process again. One side, this is the right side of my fabric facing up. Flatten this out, turn it back onto itself. The same place where that fold is, I'm just folding in the opposite direction. Pulling this so that it is right sides together. Making sure that notch is right there on that fold. Pinning it in place. Making sure my raw edges are nice and flush down here. And then giving myself a stitching line 1 1/4 inch up from my raw edge. And it should line up to that notch on the edge here. There's a tiny notch right here on the edge. I want to make sure this is nice and square. I feel like it's lifting a little bit on the edge here. I want to make sure these stay nice and flush and level at the bottom. I'll go back to my machine, and again, starting from my folded edge, I'm going to back tack here. I'm going to stitch across until I get to the end of my serge stitching, and then back tack again. Just as we did before, from my stitching line, I'm going to measure down 1 1/4 inch and give myself a cut line. From my serged edge, I'm going to measure 1/2 inch towards my folded edge at the center back, giving myself that little rectangle. Again, 1/4 inch down from the line of stitching I just did, and then a 1/2 inch in from this serged edge. This little rectangle that we're taking out is sometimes referred to as an anti-corner. It's the opposite of a corner. This would be our corner. Now we're cutting it in the opposite direction. So we're pushing this corner up into this direction. So just for future use, future knowledge, I'm going to switch scissors because I love my squeaky scissors, but I don't know if y'all want to listen to those. My other Fiskars are a little bit squeaky. So I'm going to switch to my other Fiskars. I'm going to cut out that rectangle. Trim off my extra little end here hanging out here. Keep this intact, but trim off this extra little end, just this top layer of fabric. And then I'm going to trim off this little corner of my seam allowance just to take out some of the bulk in this corner. Take it to my iron and my tailor's tack and press this seam open. Yes, little man. Yes, you can sit there. So there is that 1/4 inch pressed open. And now I can turn. Again, here's my sample from the right side so you can see what's going on here. Looking all weird and wonky. Just going to pinch that corner. One finger going in there, thumb finger. Push that corner right side out. And now I've got a nice clean finish. My hem is starting to fold itself into place. And I've got a nice clean finished edge with an extra 1/2 inch of seam allowance underneath here so that I can stitch this down with a flat catch stitch. Now that I've done one side, I've got to do the other side. So there are pros and cons to doing the vent or the slit. The slit is difficult because you have to do this fold back with an anti-corner twice. And you want to ensure that it's even each time, because you don't want to accidentally sew your anti-corner and find that it is 1/4 inch too high or 1/4 inch too low. Just going to use my friction pen to kind of mark where that needs to be so I know that I keep it level. It should still be 1 1/4 inches, but depending on how you've cut your fabric, how confident you are with your construction, there might be some things that are off, and we just want to make sure we keep these as even as possible. So the slit is nice in that we can just keep our seam allowance open all the way down, so it's really easy to press. We don't have to clip into anything. We don't have to push our seam allowance in 2 different directions, but we do have this issue of having to finish off these corners at our hem, and we've got to do it twice because we have 2 corners that need to be clean finished. inch and a quarter, inch and a quarter. And I can see my inch and a quarter mark isn't quite lining up with where I marked my fabric. So I'm just gonna be real careful to keep that as straight as possible. I'm gonna sew this on my machine, back tack, and then I'll cut out my anti-corner. Marking my 1/4 inch drop, 1/2 inch in from the serged edge. Don't measure the 1/2 inch from the folded edge. We need to push this corner up. So again, the anti-corner, we're pushing in the opposite direction. Cut this out. Trim off this extra little piece that's hanging out up top here. Trim off my corner here. You don't have to do this, but it does help reduce bulk. So practice that, because we're going to be doing that eventually. I'm going to go to the iron and press this open. Remember to use your tailor's board, your tailor's point, in order to get this tiny little seam allowance pressed open. Otherwise, you won't be able to press this directly on the ironing board. You need the tailor's point for that. Again, here's the right side of my sample as it is. I'm going to put one finger inside of there, thumb on the opposite side, turn this right side out. I'm pushing this with my thumb. My thumb's hanging out under there, so I'm pushing it out as best I can with my thumb finger. And then I'll use my awl to really push out that point. Get it nice and crisp. We don't want our corners having like little curves in them. We really want to push those corners out, get them as crisp as possible. Just be very careful that you don't poke a giant hole in your fabric. You have to be forceful, but not too heavy-handed. So that's looking pretty good. They're lining up pretty nicely. And again, you can see my hem allowance is already starting to fold itself into place. And from the inside, we have a nice clean finish. We don't have any extra seam allowances or anything hanging out around here. We've got a nice clean folded seam right at the bottom. If anybody is looking at the bottom edge of this hem, they don't need to be down there. Whatever kind of business they're doing, they don't need to be doing it. But we want to avoid any fabric just kind of bunching up, just folding up our hem and then calling it done, because it does not look attractive from these edges here, because these are going to flap and fly when someone's walking. So we want to make sure this is a nice clean finish along our slit or our vent edge. Again, we've got this ready to go, so we have a little bit of extra seam allowance hiding under there, so we can secure this with a flat catch stitch. And you can remove this to then serge all the way around the base of the skirt, all the way back to this end. So it's ready for a blind catch or a flat catch stitch, or you can turn under, finger press, then iron, and then baste in place. You can turn under that 1/4 inch there. And again, a 1/4 inch turned under. So now it's ready for slip stitching, an uneven slip stitch, or a top stitch or dungaree hem. Just make sure you lift this up when you're doing any of your slip stitching or dungaree hem. And then when it's done, flat catch this into place. And then you've got your slit ready to go. So again, here is our vent. No top stitching involved with the vent. Everything is okay. You can top stitch together. You can top stitch this together. Usually on actual garments, this will be top stitched or it'll be hand stitched inside. But for the purposes of our sample, we don't have to worry about that. But there's our vent. Just remember, got to clip into your seam allowance in order to let this press open and the rest press in that direction. We take care of the little anti-corner here. So again, we've got a nice clean finish along this folded edge and a nice clean finish right here where that seam exists for that anti-corner. And then our slit by comparison. So you can see the difference between the two. Just know that you've got to do 2 of those anti-corners if you're going to do a slit on the back of your skirt as opposed to a vent. So now that we've taken a look at vents and slits, I'm going to go ahead and install a slit on my center back. Going to fold my fabric, aligning my notches. I'll go ahead and press this seam open, and then I'll top stitch my slit into place, and then I'll finish off my hem. Mark where my top stitching is going to go. Then I'll thread trace that to the right side of my garment. I can remove my tailor's tack now that I know where to stop stitching. Don't forget a pair of tweezers can be very helpful when trying to remove these thread tailor tacks. This is why I wax my thread, because when you don't wax the thread, it gets tangled on itself. I'm not even putting a knot in my thread. Just have to make sure I don't pull it too tight. I've just marked where my top stitching is going to go, and I've just traced it with some basting thread. And now I can see my little thread marks along here, so I'm going to mark that with my friction pen. You might wonder, well, why go through the hassle? Why not just draw this out? Because you want to be certain that you're following that angle of the fabric underneath, that obtuse angle. And we want to ensure that this is even on both sides. Because if we end up stitching way out over here on one side and then making it too short on the other side, then we've got a problem. I'm just going to back tack in and out. Meaning I'll back tack at the start of my stitching and at the end of my stitching. I won't bother with tying my thread tails, especially since this is a printed fabric. You're not likely to see the back tacks as easily as you might on a solid fabric. Back tacking can be a little bit easy to detect on solid fabrics, to see all those extra lines of stitching jumbled up on itself. change my thread tracing. So I'll do my anti-corners here, and hopefully it'll be a little bit easier to see with the right and wrong sides to my fabric. So right now, this is the inside. There's my seam allowance. This is the wrong side of my garment. You can see everything is folded back, so it makes a nice clean finish on the front of the garment. I'm going to take my corner, turn it back on itself, fold right along that same line, just going in the opposite direction. I'm going to, so that I can clearly see where this is going. Again, this is just folding in on itself. And I just want to see where this is, because remember I need to start stitching from the fold, and then I want to stop where my serge stitching ends. So I'm going to label my 1¼ inch hem allowance. Should be right near the bottom of your interfacing. Identify my anti-corner. Again, 1/4 inch down from that line of stitching I just made, and a 1/2 inch in from my serge stitching from this edge towards my fold. Cut this corner out. Trim this extra little piece just on this top edge here. So I still have that 1/2 inch extension on the rest of my garment. I'm going to clip my corner. Be careful when you're clipping these corners. You don't want to clip through your stitching. Just make sure you leave a little bit of a seam allowance. Place this on my tailor's point and press this open. This is how it's looking on the inside. There's my fabric folded back, right sides together. Press that open, turn that corner right side out. It's a nice clean finish, and my hem has started to turn itself up at the correct place. I'm just going to take my awl, carefully poke out this corner. Make sure it's nice and clean, nice crisp corner. I don't want to see it kind of curving or ducking up inside of itself or anything like that. I'll just put a little bit of a finger press into my hem allowance here. I'm not going to press it just yet. I'm going to wait until I sew my side seams together, and then I can press my hem allowance up all the way around the base of my skirt. So now I'll take care of my other corner. I'm going to mark this at my hem, the previous one, so hopefully I can see through this, and I can use a pin to kind of mark where that is. Just going to invert this fold, remembering to fold along my notch. I'm going to measure my 1¼ inch just so I have that in place. I'm placing a pin right where I made my original mark because I want to make sure that it's in the right place. It's a little bit higher. So I think maybe I cut a little bit crooked on my hem down here. That should work. Inverting my fold, folding along that notch, aligning my raw edges, pinning, and I'll go to the machine to stitch this. Before I trim away my excess fabric, I'm going to try to turn this as best I can. Just make sure it's somewhat level. Just kind of push all that excess hem allowance up and inside here. Yeah, that's looking okay. All right, I'll trim my anti-corner, 1/4 of an inch down from where I just stitched. Half an inch in from my serged edge, half an inch in towards the folded side. Cut that corner out. Trim this extra little piece of fabric. Clip my corner, just reduce a little bit more of that bulk. Press this open. And then again, I'll place a finger inside, put my thumb here, turn that right side out, pushing out with my thumb. Poke out that corner with the awl. There we go, nice clean finish. They're pretty even. And my hem allowance has started to turn itself up in the direction that I want it to. So there is the slit on the back of my skirt. So we've gotten through the front subassembly, our darts, pockets, and the like. Remember, it's up to you what kind of pocket you want to install. Back is now stitched together. We've got our closure installed. Now is a good time to sew the side seams. And we will work on sewing these side seams and attaching our waistband in the next video.